My boyfriend spent every free hour digging a tunnel on our inherited plot, and it's been a week since he disappeared. I first noticed something unusual about my boyfriend, Marcus, when our dates began to shift from late-night movies and cozy dinners to short walks around the edge of his newly inherited land. At first, it seemed charming, even rustic, the idea that this land represented his roots and family history. But over time, I realized he was not interested in the wide-open spaces or the wind-rustled trees. Instead, he was focused on what was beneath the surface. It all started innocently enough. Marcus had inherited property from his grandfather, a man whose presence in his life he both revered and lightly resented. Grandfather Elias had always been slightly eccentric. He collected bizarre antiques, had a penchant for reading obscure texts, and spent the final years of his life speaking about matters no one truly understood. One such fixation was the notion of digging, of going underground, establishing an intricate warren of corridors through the earth, and discovering some hidden calm in the dense, silent darkness. As a child, Marcus would laugh at these stories, but I can't help thinking they planted a seed deep within him. Maybe it was a subconscious connection to his family legacy, or maybe it was the comforting memory of sitting at his grandfather's knee, listening to improbable tales about the wonders that could be found beneath the soil. Regardless of the true cause, something compelled Marcus to start digging. Back then, we had been together for almost 2 years, and we were comfortable with each other's quirks. I even teased him about it at first. The property he inherited included a modest old farmhouse and a couple of acres of land, peppered with shrubs and pine trees, just enough to grant a sense of privacy. By all accounts, there was nothing spectacular about the old place beyond that intangible sense of belonging one feels toward inherited land. Yet every weekend, then nearly every day, Marcus disappeared into the far corner of the property where the ground sloped downward slightly. At first, he only carried a shovel and a small metal box of supplies. Little by little, I started to see him carting out more sophisticated equipment: lumber for supports, flashlights, a generator, cement mix, rebar, an old wheelbarrow with reinforced tire. It was a slow escalation that I didn't notice until the scale of the tunnel began to grow. In those early days, I had no reason to worry. His new hobby was intriguing. Like I said, he never seemed happier than when he was returning from the property, covered in dirt and dust, stepping carefully out of his soil-stained boots. He would stand at the doorstep of my apartment or sometimes on the creaky porch of his farmhouse, grin from ear to ear, and greet me as if he had just discovered a small secret about the world, something that gave him peace, something that, for whatever reason, no one else had. Over time, though, I watched with concern as Marcus began devoting more and more of his free hours to the tunnel. He no longer dropped by to see me after work quite as often. Phone calls that used to last an hour were cut short after only a few minutes. He'd often say, "I'm sorry, babe, but I really need to get back to the property. I just realized something I can fix or improve in the tunnel." At first, I would shrug and say goodnight, imagining he'd only be a little busy for a few days. But a few days turned into a few weeks, and after a month, I realized that this was no fleeting hobby. This was an obsession. I began noticing a certain hollowness to our relationship, the way you can feel an echo in a once cozy house when you realize someone has moved out. We still lived together, but Marcus was more often gone than present. If he wasn't at his day job, he was on the property. He would come home late, tracking dust across the floor, his clothes caked in dried mud, his hair damp with sweat. He'd strip off his jacket, sometimes toss it haphazardly onto the couch. When I tried to greet him, to ask him about his day or invite him to watch a show we both used to love, he'd reply with a half-distracted smile, "Give me just a minute, I need to shower," and then vanish upstairs. Later, he'd collapse into bed, physically and mentally exhausted, paying little attention to. We had arguments. They started small. I'd ask him for just one night to ourselves, and he'd say, "But I have plans to dig tomorrow. Can we do it another time?" Over and over, it was the same conversation. I felt neglected, but I also felt guilty for wanting to pull him away from the one thing that brought him joy. And it did bring him joy. Nothing else in his life seemed to give him that same spark. One morning, I tried to catch him in the kitchen before he headed off to work. "Marcus," I said, pouring a cup of coffee for him, "we need to talk. You're spending so much time in that tunnel. I'm worried. Tunnels can collapse. Dirt is unpredictable. People can get trapped. I want to ask you to slow down, or at least be extremely careful." He looked at me over the rim of his mug. "I've watched some YouTube videos on tunnel reinforcing," he said, in a tone that suggested that was enough. "And my grandfather had these old manuals about building structures underground. Plus, I can feel when it's safe." "Feel when it's safe?" I repeated. "Marcus, that's not exactly scientifically sound. Are you at least checking if you hit any pockets of gas or if there's a chance of floodwater?" "Sometimes water trickles in," he admitted. "But it's not a big deal. I'm careful. I have a small pump to push water out if it accumulates. For gas, well, it's farmland, not an industrial zone. I doubt there's anything toxic. I sighed, trying to keep frustration at bay. I just don't want you to get hurt. His expression softened, and he reached across the kitchen counter, placing his hand on mine. I appreciate that. I promise I'm being careful. This place is everything to me. I wouldn't do anything stupid to jeopardize it or myself. But I still worry. The more he dug, the less socially active he became. Marcus was never a party animal, but he used to enjoy going out to dinner, meeting our mutual friends for small gatherings, or spending quiet weekends away on spontaneous trips. Now, the only trip he cared about was the short drive to his inherited property, shovel in tow. The effect on our relationship was heartbreaking in its subtlety. We never had a big meltdown or explosive confrontation. Instead, we drifted apart like two ships that no longer share the same route. I missed him, even though his body was sometimes right there next to me in bed. He might have been physically present, but his mind was always in that tunnel. I confided in my best friend Laura. On a sunny afternoon at a local cafe, we sat beneath a shade umbrella, the sound of city traffic in the background, as I tried to put words to my anxieties. Laura, I said, stirring my latte compulsively, I think Marcus might be losing it. I mean, who devotes nearly every waking hour to digging a giant hole in the ground? And it's not just any hole, it's huge. He's been out there for about a year now, and by his own admission, he's not close to done. I barely see him. Laura, a practical and straightforward woman, pursed her lips. That's bizarre. Is he depressed, maybe? Or is there some deeper reason for this? I nodded. He says it makes him feel safe, at peace. Like the world can't touch him when he's underground. But I worry for his mental health. If you want that level of isolation, you'd go live in a cabin in the woods or something. This is different. It's like he's physically digging himself an escape route from reality. She exhaled sharply. And you say he's ignoring you? That's a bad sign. He should at least be open to a balance. If he truly cares about the relationship, he needs to consider your feelings too. I know, I said. I've told him that. But I guess I haven't really laid it all out. I keep hinting that I'm worried, hoping he'll get the message. Maybe I need to be more direct. Laura shook her head. If he's this fixated, you'll have to have a serious sit-down conversation. Spell out exactly what you need and let him know the toll it's taking on you. Offer solutions too. Maybe there's a compromise. But it might not just be about compromise. Maybe he needs help. If he's got an underlying problem, therapy might be important. I grimaced. He doesn't believe in therapy. Says you only go if something's wrong with you. But he doesn't see that maybe there is something at least partly off. Obsessions like this don't normally pop up out of nowhere. Laura's expression was sympathetic but firm. Then it's time to push him on it. Don't let him keep you on the sidelines. I mean, you love him, right? You owe it to both of you to try. I swallowed, feeling tears prick at the back of my eyes. I do love him. That's why this is so confusing. I know, she said quietly, but you have to stand firm. That conversation planted a seed of determination. I realized that subtle hints and mild suggestions would never pry Marcus away from his passion for digging. I was going to have to confront him, even if it risked an argument that might scare me more than the quiet drift we were experiencing. Before I found the courage to sit Marcus down for that fateful talk, something happened on a random Thursday evening that rattled me. Marcus had stayed out late again. Usually, he'd come home around 9 or 10, enough time for a quick shower and a few words before we both collapsed into bed. But that night, it was nearly midnight, and I was pacing in the living room, phone in hand, calling him repeatedly with no answer. A storm brewed outside. Rain lashed against the windows, and every gust of wind sent the branches of trees scraping ominously across the siding. My imagination got the best of me. I pictured him in the tunnel, water seeping in, the walls collapsing around him. Or maybe he slipped in the mud outside, hit his head, and now lay unconscious, alone in the dark. My fear became unbearable, and I decided I had to go check on it. Grabbing my coat and keys, I rushed out into the raging storm. The drive was treacherous. Water pooled on the roadway, and lightning illuminated the sky in frantic flashes. When I reached the farmhouse, I saw that no lights were on inside. The only illumination came from a single lamp in the front room. The rest of the property was a flood of darkness. My heart thudded with anxiety as I parked and dashed through puddles toward the hill where the tunnel entrance lay. What if he was trapped? My breath caught in my throat as I approached the slope, expecting to see destruction or something equally disastrous. Instead, I found Marcus standing just inside the open mouth of the tunnel, wearing a heavy rain poncho, shining a flashlight at the ground. He turned abruptly, startled by the beam of my headlights or the noise of my frantic footsteps in the mud. "Hey!" I shouted above the howling wind. "Are you okay?" "You weren't answering your phone." He blinked at me, and when the lightning flashed overhead, I caught the look of pure surprise in his eyes. I didn't hear it. I left it on the shelf in the tunnel. The storm knocked out power for a minute, and I was worried about water seepage. I had to make sure everything stayed dry. I stared at him, anger and relief crashing into me all at once. "I thought you were hurt or worse." "It's almost midnight. You didn't think to call me?" He took a step closer, voice muffled by the roar of the wind. I'm sorry. I got so focused on making sure everything was okay down. I didn't realize how late it was. The generator was acting up too. The tension in my body finally exploded into tears. I felt foolish for crying, but I couldn't help it. My relief that he was safe mixed with my anger that he'd scared me. We stood there in the mud and the storm, water drenching both of us as he pulled me into a hug. I sobbed into his poncho. Marcus, I can't do this anymore. I need you to understand that you can't just disappear into that hole in the ground without telling me. I was terrified something happened. He pressed his chin into the top of my head. I'm sorry, he murmured. I really am. I feel responsible for this place, for the tunnel, and I lost track of time. We drove home together that night in silence, the tension between us palpable. I clenched the steering wheel, the lights of the occasional oncoming car smearing across the windshield through the sheets of rain. Marcus reached out once or twice, resting a hand on my shoulder in a small attempt at comfort, but neither of us spoke. Once we were back home, I dried off and climbed into bed, too exhausted to talk. I heard him quietly rummaging around, perhaps feeling guilty but not knowing what to say. A few days passed before I gathered my courage to tackle the issue head-on. My worry for Marcus had reached a boiling point. It wasn't just about the storm incident or my loneliness. It was about the fundamental nature of our relationship. I realized if we didn't resolve this, something was going to break. Either him, me, or the fragile bond we share. On a Thursday evening, I decided enough was enough. I waited for him to return from work. He came through the door, changed clothes, and was about to leave for the tunnel when I intercepted him in the hallway, arms crossed. We need to talk, I said, my voice firm. He paused, seeing my determination, and nodded. Okay, let's talk. We sat down at the kitchen table, the place that once symbolized warmth and shared meals, but now felt like neutral territory for a confrontation. I looked at him across the table, noting the signs of strain. His face was thinner, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He was wearing a stained work shirt, and there was dirt under his fingernails. In that moment, I felt a pang of sadness for the man I loved, who seemed so lost in his own world beneath the ground. I took a deep breath. Marcus, I love you, but this tunnel, this obsession, is tearing us apart. You spend almost all your free time there. You're risking your safety and your health. You brush off the possibility of a collapse or toxic gas. You're exhausted. You come home late, and we barely spend time together any. I feel like I'm losing you to a hole in the earth. He lowered his gaze, tracing a small crack in the table's surface with his fingertip. I didn't realize how big of a toll it was taking on you. It's my sanctuary down. When I'm in the tunnel, I feel calm, like nothing can hurt me. The world up here can be so chaotic, but down there, the only sound is the scraping of the shovel and my own breath. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. I understand that. I want you to have something that gives you peace, but it can't consume you. You're forgetting to live up here, with me, with friends, with people who care about you. I'm worried for your mental health. Obsessions like this don't just spring up out of nowhere. Maybe you're feeling overwhelmed or anxious about something else. He sighed heavily. Look, when my grandfather died and left me this property, it felt like a calling. My grandfather always told me stories about how comforting it was to be underground, how it connected him to, I don't know, some deeper part of himself. I guess I wanted to recreate that feeling, or maybe surpass it. And I kept going because it felt like the only place I could truly breathe. Marcus, I said softly, that's valid, but it's not sustainable. You're ignoring your social life, your health, our relationship, and you're risking a catastrophic accident. I need you to find a balance. If you can't do that, you need help. He looked up at me, tears shining in his eyes. I don't want to lose you. I guess I just got carried away. I thought you were okay with it, because whenever I came home, you didn't say too much. I let out a weary chuckle that held no amusement. I tried in my own way to tell you I was uncomfortable, but I was afraid of pushing you away. You looked so happy after coming back from the tunnel, and I didn't want to take that from you. He squeezed my hand. I'm sorry. I should have noticed you were uncomfortable. You are important to me, more important than any underground project. For a moment, the silence between us felt like a fragile piece. If that's true, I said, then you'll start cutting back. Spend half the time you do now in the tunnel. And please, let's make sure it's safe. Look into better ventilation, real structural supports. Maybe talk to someone who actually knows about subterranean construction. I know you've been winging it, but there are experts out there. He nodded quickly. I will. If it'll make you feel safer, I'll do it. I sighed with relief, feeling the knots in my chest loosen slightly. Thank you, I whispered. And consider talking to someone, like a counselor. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It just means you're going through something that might be too big to handle alone. He shifted uncomfortably. I'll think about it. I promise. True to his word, Marcus drastically cut back the time he spent in the tunnel. Instead of heading there immediately after work on weekdays, he came home 2 nights in a row. We cooked dinner together, something we hadn't done in months. It felt strange at first, navigating the kitchen side by side, bumping elbows as we chopped vegetables and stirred pots. But it also felt right. We laughed more than we had in ages, and the tension that had been suffocating us began to lift. On Friday evening, he took me out to dinner at our favorite little Italian restaurant. The smell of tomato sauce and garlic bread enveloped us in a sense of comforting nostalgia. We sat in a corner booth, sipping wine and sharing a plate of creamy fettuccine Alfredo, leaning our heads close to talk. "How does it feel?" I asked. "Not being underground right now?" He smiled wryly. "Strange," he admitted. "I keep thinking about it, like a nagging desire to check if everything's okay. But I'm trying to focus on the present, on you, on us." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I appreciate that. I hope you know I'm not trying to take away your happiness. I just want to make sure you have a healthy balance." He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I do. And I'm starting to realize that, ironically, I'll enjoy the tunnel more if it's not the only thing in my life." It was starting to feel heavy, you know? On Saturday, we spent the entire day walking through the local park, rummaging through record stores, and sipping iced coffees at a trendy cafe. It felt good, almost like we had rewound to the early days of our relationship, before the tunnel dominated his mental space. There were occasional moments when he seemed to drift off, no doubt thinking about the structure he had left behind. But each time, he caught himself, looked at me, and smiled in a way that said, "I'm still here." Come Sunday, I suggested a lazy day at home, maybe catching up on some shows or reading side by side on the couch. After a few hours, though, I noticed he started tapping his foot, checking the clock on his phone. I recognized the restless energy of a man who was missing his private sanctuary. My heart sank a bit, but I forced a smile. I recalled my friend's advice to find a compromise. "Do you want to go to the property?" I asked gently. "It's okay if you do. You've already spent so much time with me this weekend." He exhaled, relief evident. "Are you sure?" I nodded, waving a hand. "Yes, go. I know it means a lot to you." He didn't argue further. He got up, pulled on his boots and jacket, and gave me a soft kiss on the cheek before heading out. I felt a mixture of pride and sadness as the door closed behind him, but I reminded myself that this was progress, not perfection. While Marcus showed real effort in balancing his time, I couldn't shake the sense that the root of his obsession still lay buried. He mentioned he felt safe and calm underground, but why did he need that so desperately? I suspected it had something to do with his grandfather's eccentricities, or perhaps some deeper anxiety that was manifesting as a need to dig, to control a small universe beneath the surface. One night, not long after he promised to cut back, we were curled up in bed. I hesitated, but finally asked the question that had been burning at the back of my mind. "Do you ever feel depressed, Marcus? Like, besides the tunnel and me, do you look forward to anything else?" He lay quietly for a moment, staring at the dark sea. "I don't know if depressed is the right word. Sometimes I feel like the world is just too loud, too complicated. It's easier to be in that quiet space, where it's just me and the earth." I cuddled closer, resting my head on his shoulder. "That sounds like you're trying to shut out the noise of life. Maybe that noise is something we can address. We all have stress, but if you're feeling overwhelmed, it might help to talk it out." He was silent for a while, then he whispered, "My grandfather used to tell me that life above ground was always going to disappoint, that I'd find more truth and solace in the stillness below. I never really believed him. But after he died, I felt this strange pull to see if he was right." My heart clenched. "Are you disappointed by life above ground?" He shook his head vigorously. I have you. That's reason enough not to be disappointed. But sometimes I can't shake the feeling that I'm missing some part of me that can only be found in the darkness and quiet." I breathed in, letting his words settle. "Maybe what you're missing isn't in the earth. Maybe it's something you can find by working on yourself, your relationships, your sense of purpose." He kissed the top of my head. "You might be right. I think a part of me was using the tunnel as an escape, but I promise I'm working on it. Every day, I choose to be here with you, at least part of the time." I accepted that answer for the moment, though I still thought professional help could guide him better than I could. But I decided not to push that issue right then. One step at a time. One of the main concerns we had, well, that I had, was the structural integrity of the tunnel. True to his word, Marcus looked into ways to make it safer. He bought some industrial-grade ventilation equipment, modest but effective, to circulate fresh air. He also reinforced parts of the corridor that were already showing signs of age. The deeper sections were basically raw dirt and hastily braced beams, so he invested in stronger lumber and designed a plan to methodically replace the weaker supports. He even found an old gas mask in his dad's storage unit, something from his father's days in construction, and cleaned it up for potential use. This might have been overkill, but in a weird way, it made me feel better. Marcus also began logging the exact dimensions of each new section he dug, writing down angles, approximate depth, soil composition, anything he could glean. He told me it was a bit like cartography of an underground realm. He was proud but also methodical, which reassured me. If he was going to keep digging, at least he was doing it with a semblance of caution. I visited the tunnel's entryway a few times during these renovations. Marcus would show me the new supports or the ventilation fan whirring in the distance. He explained the process of how he intended to expand carefully, a few feet at a time, then reinforce with beams and crossbars. I didn't have the technical expertise to confirm how safe it actually was, but I appreciated that he was finally acknowledging the risk and doing something about it. A few weeks into our new balance, Marcus asked me if I wanted to see the deeper part of the tunnel. Until that point, I had only ventured in about 20 or 30 feet, stopping where the corridor started to narrow and the dust got thicker. A knot of anxiety formed in my stomach at the prospect of going deeper, but a part of me was curious. This was a huge part of his life, and maybe experiencing it with him would bring us closer. I agreed, albeit nervously. On a cool Saturday morning, we drove to the property together. Marcus handed me a flashlight, a hard hat, and a thick pair of boots. "Just in case," he said with a reassuring smile. I slid them on, my hands trembling with a mix of excitement and fear. Then we descended into his subterranean world. The first corridor was, as I remember, comfortably lit by a string of electric bulbs and well reinforced with beams and metal rods. There was a small table and chairs near the entrance. His break room, he liked to joke. Farther in, the passage narrowed, and the floor felt slightly uneven. Occasionally, we had to step over shallow puddles or minor debris, but overall, the environment felt stable, if a bit eerie. Marcus guided me down a gentle slope, shining his brighter flashlight ahead. We reached a new section that branched off in two directions. One corridor led upward slightly, and Marcus explained it was a side project he'd eventually expand. The other corridor veered downward again, deeper into the earth. The air grew cooler, and the smell of wet soil intensified. My chest felt tight, both from the physical sensation of being underground and the psychological weight of being surrounded by thousands of pounds of earth. At one point, we stopped near a large wooden brace. Marcus ran his hand over the beam, pointing out how he'd angled it to distribute the weight of the overhead soil more effectively. "See this? Before, I had a simpler brace, but it was starting to bow. I replaced it last week." "You did all this alone?" I asked, my voice echoing off the damp walls. He nodded, a hint of pride in his smile. "It's taken a lot of time, but it's worth it." We moved deeper, and the corridor opened into a small, domed chamber. Marcus's generator-powered lights were strung around the circumference, creating a strangely cozy glow. In the middle of the chamber, he'd set up a bench made of two wooden crates and a thick plank. It looked like a makeshift seat. "Is this where you come to relax?" I asked, marveling that he had managed to carve out an entire room underground. He shrugged. "Sometimes. I know it looks like a weird man cave, but it's where I feel the calmest. It's almost like a meditation space." I slowly walked around, shining my flashlight along the curved ceiling. I saw thick, moist soil, layered with streaks of clay and rock. Wooden beams were spaced at intervals to hold it all in place. At any other time, I might have been terrified. Yet, in that moment, I felt a strange hut, like we were in some hallowed ground that existed separate from the hustle of life above. I could see why Marcus found it calming. The air was still, the only sound our breathing and the gentle hum of the ventilation fan somewhere in the corridor behind us. He patted the seat, and I joined him. We sat side by side, shoulders touching, flashlights pointing at our feet. "It's kind of peaceful," I admitted, feeling an unexpected sense of serenity wash over me. He turned to me with a soft expression. "Sometimes when life is too loud, I come here, and I remember that the earth has been here for billions of years. Our worries, our stress, they're so small compared to that. It helps me put things in perspective." I gazed at him, heart aching with love and understanding. This was the man I'd been so worried about. Maybe it wasn't that he was insane or depressed. Maybe this was his way of grounding himself, literally. That didn't mean it was entirely healthy, but I understood the appeal. Still, I also remembered the strain it had put on our relationship. "Marcus," I said soft, "I don't ever want to take this from you, but I'm glad you're making room for me in your life again." He reached out, took my hand. "Thank you for not giving up on me. I know it must have been tough, watching me get so lost in this place." My voice trembled slightly. "Promise me you'll keep up with your safety precautions and that you'll keep balancing your time. I can handle you coming down here, but not at the cost of losing you in every other aspect of life." He squeezed my hand tighter. "I promise." For a few minutes, we just sat there, letting the silent earth hold us. Strangely enough, I felt closer to him in that moment than I had in months. In the days and weeks following that underground revelation, Marcus continued to keep his promise. He devoted some evenings and a portion of his weekends to the tunnel, but not his entire life. He went out with me for dinner more often. We attended a few social gatherings, surprising friends who thought we had disappeared from the face of the earth. Marcus even reached out to an old college buddy who was an engineer, asking for input on the structural integrity of his underground passages. That buddy provided him with guidelines, resources, and pointed him towards safer construction methods. Though Marcus was still hesitant about therapy, he eventually agreed to attend a few couples counseling sessions with me. He admitted that it was uncomfortable at first, but as he opened up, he found relief in talking to a neutral third party about his anxieties and the sense of peace he sought. The therapist helped him realize that while having a personal sanctuary is fine, allowing it to consume all aspects of life is not. Marcus also began to understand that his need for escape might stem from deeper issues: stress, fear of failure, or even unresolved grief over his grandfather's death. Our relationship, once on the brink of collapse, began to mend. It was not an overnight fix. We still had moments of tension. There were days when Marcus would disappear longer than planned or get lost in his excitement for the next digging session. But each time, he caught himself or responded when I voiced my concern. The difference was that now I felt heard. He would make the effort to recalibrate. On a bright Sunday morning, we sat on the porch of the old farmhouse, sipping coffee, listening to the birds that flitted among the pines. Marcus looked over at me, a crooked smile on his lips. "I still want to expand the tunnel," he confessed. "I have ideas for a secondary chamber, maybe even an underground greenhouse, though I'm not sure how feasible that is." He laughed lightly at his own ambition. I laughed as well, sliding closer to him on the porch swing. "Go ahead and dream, but keep 1 foot above ground with me, okay?" He slid an arm around my shoulder. "Always," he promised. He still came home with dirt under his nails, and he still occasionally spent long hours underground. But the difference lay in the boundaries he respected and the care he took both for his own safety and for our relationship. He installed better air quality monitors, set up a schedule to check the beams, and decided never to dig alone at night or during severe weather. He also made sure that every time he emerged from that quiet cocoon of earth, he returned to me as someone present and engaged in our shared life. Sometimes, while we read books together on the couch, I would look over at him, watch the concentration on his face, and feel a wave of gratitude. Gratitude that I didn't let the distance between us grow too large. Gratitude that we talked before it was too late. Gratitude that he found a way to keep doing what gave him peace without sacrificing the relationship we both value. At last, I felt hopeful about our future. Hopeful that Marcus and I would continue to build a life together, one that could accommodate his tunnel without letting it overshadow everything else. He joked that he'd eventually turn it into an underground guest room or wine cellar, something normal people might appreciate. I joked that he should maybe just write a book about it. In the end, Marcus did not abandon the tunnel, nor did he dive fully into isolation. Instead, he discovered how to thread the needle between obsession and passion, between solitary pursuits and shared life. I learned the importance of speaking up for my own needs and fears, rather than silently hoping he'd read my mind. We both learned that love can thrive even in unexpected places, like a deep tunnel in the side of a hill, so long as it's nurtured with honesty, respect, and compromise. Above all, we learned that sometimes, to find your way back to each other, you have to be willing to dig deep, face the darkness, and shine a light on the fears that dwell beneath the surface.